All right, everyone, welcome to week number 1 of our Southeast Online Bible study. It's coming from the Sermon on the Mount. It's called Everything is Backwards. And so this week, we're going to be talking about the first part of Matthew chapter 5, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, called the Beatitudes. You may have heard that before. One of the things that happened that I found super interesting was when we were getting ready, Brandon sent the team a text about this, and it was so thoughtful that I wanted to share it with you because I think what he was trying to convey to Sarah and Derek and I as we were preparing for this is what I want to convey to you. And so he sent this to us and he said to think about what sticks out most to you as you read this. Like, don't get stressed is what he was trying to say. And he said, put yourself on the hillside. It's the Sermon on the Mount. And just listen. What would have shocked you? What would have made you laugh? What would have made you want to walk away? Just to sit there and listen to the teaching of Jesus, because I think that will transform your life. So let me invite you in right now. It's week number 1. We're going to be talking about the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. And so this is an invitation to just sit and listen and allow the teaching of Jesus to transform your heart. All right, so it's week 1 of Everything is Backwards, where we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And before we get going on to the first section, which is famous as the Beatitudes, and we know some of those, we'll talk about that second. I wanted us to set the stage and ask each of you a question before we really dive into the text. And I think that question will step us back a little bit and help us understand like what this is. Because I think most people have heard of the Sermon on the Mount, but we need some context as to what it is. So as we get going, when you hear the Sermon on the Mount, what is the idea of this? What is it all about? And what is the context of what the Sermon on the Mount is? So Brandon, why don't you kick us off with what it is?
Yeah, so this comes very early in Matthew's gospel, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, longest continuous body of Jesus' teaching. And it's really kind of his proclamation of the kingdom. It begins in, it doesn't begin in Matthew 5, 4:17, but it kind of sets the stage because he shows up on the scene and he tells people, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And so we move kind of from the proclamation of the kingdom to, I guess what I would say is the practicality of it here.
Look at that. So proclamation and practicality.
Yes, yeah, very preacherly there.
Yeah, very well done.
Yes, yeah. So he's moving us to help us define, like, this is what the kingdom looks like, and this is what it means to live in that reality.
All right, Sarah, Derek, what are you thinking on this?
I think the thing that stands out to me most about Sermon on the Mount, that it's very just countercultural, but it's also counterintuitive because it's not what you would expect. Not only culturally, but also like intuitively.
Yeah, and that's the backwards part of calling it everything is backwards is intentional because it's counterintuitive and counterculture.
Right. It goes against everything they would think. And he's going to say, like, you heard it said, and they think they know what's coming. And then he completely turns it on its head.
Good. Well done. Derek?
Yeah, as I was kind of preparing for this, and I love the Bible Project and Tim Mackie and what he has to say about especially this. It's interesting how we focus so much on external behavior, and everything that Jesus talks about is really internal, right? So he's taking these concepts of these laws in the Old Testament, a lot of them being in the 10 Commandments that we would recognize, and a lot of people would think, well, I don't murder, I don't do this stuff, but like the expectation that God has for us is far greater sometimes than what we even realize.
Yeah.
And like we realize that sometimes in our own sinful nature. However, what's amazing and something that Tim Mackie brought up is that what Jesus is doing here is that really he's describing himself. He's describing his own character of what we're called to. And the point being that we're called to be different from the world, right? Completely different from the world, much like the nation of Israel. However, we don't match up. Yeah. Like Sarah was saying, we just don't measure up to what Jesus is calling us to, because a lot of these things are heart problems. Yeah. Right? Not necessarily behavior problems.
And I love what you guys are each pointing to, because the thing I'm going to take this to a little bit, which will make me nervous as I take us there, is political with this. It's a political statement, which is what you're hinting at there, and what you hinted at with the word kingdom, and what you were saying there, Derek, is if Jesus was actually king, And if he was actually like literally here on earth reigning as king, what would that actually look like if we lived that out and it came to life? And I think one of the better ways I like understanding the Sermon on the Mount is think of this as not a one-off event. I mean, it's an event that happened, but it happened a lot. This wasn't the only time this speech was given, the sermon was given. This is his political stump speech, right? We see that in the presidential races as they move from city to city and town to town. They're saying the same things. They will adapt it to the cultural, norms of where they're visiting. But this is the kingdom stump speech. Yeah. This is the teaching of Jesus. When you hear the different parts of the Gospels where it says Jesus sat down and taught them, and you're like, well, what did he teach them? These are some of the things. These are the key teachings of that. And I think that helps us reframe it in a political context. If Jesus is king, right, and if we are a part of that kingdom, this is what it looks like. And this is what this kingdom will be. And this is how you are to interact with it. And I do think that political stump speech is super helpful. So it begins with a section we call the Beatitudes, is the first section, which I find the word beatitude kind of a strange word. We don't use the word beatitude. I don't use the word beatitude
use that often?
outside of the biblical
I feel like Brandon does. I feel like Brandon just throws that in his normal life.
Before we talk about the Beatitudes, Brandon, why don't you set us up on this section that Jesus begins with in the Sermon on the Mount?
Yeah, so Jesus begins with, before we get to some of the commandments and before we get to some of the requirements of living in the kingdom, Jesus begins with just a statement of blessing over those who would live in the kingdom and what their life looks like. And I think he starts here because these statements all are just like little truth bombs. Like they immediately would kind of put the crowd questioning, like, well, no, like everything we thought we knew is wrong. Like the poor are blessed and those who mourn are blessed. And you would immediately recognize, like, well, then something is wrong with the way that we're living. But the good side of all this is if you go back into Matthew chapter 4, at the very end of the chapter, it talks about at this moment in Jesus' ministry, they're bringing all of these sick people and all of these people who are hurting and who are poor to Jesus. And he stands up in front of them and says, you're blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So there's this twin message of like everything you know is wrong, but everything you've ever hoped is true. That you are blessed and God blesses people like you. And I think,
but the hope and the blessing isn't found where you think it's found.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think these Beatitudes are just, I guess I said earlier, they're meant to kind of throw you off kilter, but they're also meant to comfort a little bit, to say, no, this kingdom is for you. And so gather around and listen to what I have to say.
Yeah. What do you guys think about that?
I was going to say, I love how he just starts it off. Actually, the very first Beatitude is my favorite because it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I was reading actually Kyle's book about the Sermon on the Mount, and he phrased it as this. He said, blessed are those who have nothing to offer. And I love how that's stated because it's so true. Like, we have nothing to offer Jesus, and he's saying that's okay because you're going to be valuable in the kingdom of heaven. And I just love that. It gives hope for me when I feel like I have nothing to offer.
There you go. I was going to say, that's
value.
pretty hopeful. Like, it's I got a C on that one. I'm like, okay,
right.
Blessed.
Right. And I love that he starts that out because that kind of encapsulates all of us, right? And especially that crowd who he was speaking to of like, it's okay if you feel like you're not valuable because I see you and I value you.
Yeah. What are you thinking, Derek?
Yeah, I think Sarah's right. As I was studying through this, one of the things Tim Mackey had brought up was that for the guy from the Bible Project was that like literally Jesus had called a few of his disciples right at this point, but not, it doesn't. It's not like this full exclusive 12. Like what Brandon was saying is that there's a lot of people here that are sick, poor, and with you're talking about, Stephen, this political message of this just a very important moment. Like you would think in a worldly level, you'd think that you would want to have very powerful, influential people there, right? And that's not who Jesus is calling blessed, right? That's not who he's calling blessed. And you see that theme all throughout Jesus's teaching and within the Gospels. Whether it's the rich young ruler, whether it's the woman who the widow that's giving just the penny, right, that she has, just paraphrasing, and that's more than anybody else had given there. And it's this concept that like we live in this mirage in this world that we think that when people have power, or they have money, or they have success, that like we think as humans that means something. Yeah. Like we think that means something, but really it doesn't.
Well, and really the blessing of God is this eternal quality and the blessings of man will disappear. And he connects to that, and he says to those that have no reason to be filled with hope, to say to those that have no reason to think there is a blessing left for them, and says, from an eternal perspective, the thing that all these people will sacrifice all their power, position, and possessions and money for is available to you. And not only that, I think he allows you guys can see it better. One of my favorite verses from the Old Testament is that the poor have hope and injustice shuts its mouth. I love that phrase, because this is coming to life right here, where he says to the sick, to the poor, to those that are on the outside politically, he says, you are valued members of my kingdom that goes forever. Buckle up. And there's a hope. And that's what I keep reading into this is hope. That there's a blessing for everyone. And how hopeful is that?
Well, and it's very interesting when you look at the promises attached to the Beatitudes, that they're very future oriented, like they will be comforted and they will be shown mercy, but they're also rooted in present reality. Because the opening beatitude and the closing beatitude both give the promise that the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Like it already belongs to you when you are this way. And so I think that Jesus is reminding us of hope, but he's also pointing us to this reality that we currently live in now. Like, hey, you live as though God's kingdom is here and be that sort of person now.
Yeah, I do love that. So as we read this and on these opening verses called the Beatitudes, let's set the stage for what the kingdom looks like, because we've referred to this as political. One of the things I love pointing out is that Jesus was very political and made political things we don't see, right? Like he calls the 12, there's 12 tribes of Israel. They notice that. When he sends out the 72 members of the Sanhedrin, I can't remember if it's 70 or 72. There's you'll know that better, but that's how many members of the Sanhedrin there were. Like he's making very political statements, and he's using political language here with this about his kingdom. Even his death charge is political. This is Jesus, King of the Jews. They crown him with a crown of thorns, just mocking this kingdom. And then 3 days later, he reigns forever and triumphs over death and makes a mockery of their mockery. And so that's all there. But as I zero into the Beatitudes in these opening verses, let's talk for a minute and apply this. What does this kingdom look like, guys? So when we think about the kingdom that he's setting up here, let's get to our lives with it. Based on these opening verses, Sarah, what's our kingdom look like here?
I was just thinking, it's so different than they expect, but it's so much better. I know, even for me, when I read this, I can't imagine being there and listening to Jesus and just thinking, they just had their world turned upside down, because he's saying, you've heard it said, and a lot of these guys have had the Old Testament memorized their entire life. So he's saying, you have had this burn into your brain, but I'm going to tell you something different. And it's so interesting because he is the culmination of all of that they have memorized, and it's still blowing their minds.
Love it.
But yeah, just so much different, but better than they expect.
Derek, what about you?
Yeah, I think that we often, when I think of the word kingdom, I think it brings up images of the movie 300 or Thor that just came out. And so it brings out this, you have this strong kingdom of warriors that are very competent and capable. God, and maybe there's a reality like that in the future that I don't understand right now. But the interesting thing about these people that Jesus is talking to and preaching to is that these are people who literally have nothing. What else can they lose?
Right.
What else can they lose? And so for us, to be these people that are merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, we're hunger and thirsting for righteousness. It's because these people are in such a place of humility in their life that they desperately know. I remember Tim Mackey was saying this in the Bible Project about how hunger and thirst, if you've truly been hungry or thirsty, that's not a pleasant experience. That's not a pleasant experience. And that's your desperation for Jesus. And I think it's a challenge for me in my life of do I have that relationship with Jesus where I truly am dependent on him, or do I think I can figure it out on my own?
I love that you said that.
That's a good point, Derek, just because I was thinking as you were saying that it's not a pleasant experience, but those are the only ways that we see the different characteristics of the Lord that we would not see otherwise. Because think about, blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. We don't want to mourn, but the only way that we experience true comfort from Jesus is going through that suffering and going through that mourning. I know for me, like, I would not have seen some of the goodness of the Lord and some of his like true peace and his comfort in my life if I had not gone through some hard things. And it's true, like, going through these unpleasant experiences is not great, but you get to depend on Jesus, like you were saying, in a way that you never would have otherwise.
Yeah, but Brandon, before I get to you for the last word, I love what you said there. You know, one of my work is I've worked in third world countries and I'm friends with people that have been hungry and thirsty, and I've had them say to me, you have no idea what it's like to be hungry and be dead serious. You have no idea what real thirst is. And just me knowing that. And I think when you see this, that's exactly right. Your blinders are gone and you can really see what it is. So Brandon, as we bring a close to this section of scripture here, why don't you wrap us up here?
Well, two things I would just point out with all we've talked about. The first is, you know, Jesus follows up the Beatitudes with the teaching on salt and light. And I think it's a powerful reminder to us, because we could read the Beatitudes and think, oh, well, we need to run off and form our own kingdom. Yeah. Like, we need to go somewhere else to live because we can't do that here. But Jesus reminds us, right, that even the political nature of this is you got to stay where you're at, and you got to be salt and light in the context you are, and start spreading this kingdom kind of covertly in the midst of where you live.
And I love that the salt and light, I know it gets confusing, right? Like, salt brings flavor to life, right? It brings flavor to food, so we bring flavor to life. And then also, you're illuminating people. You're bringing light into the world. Okay, keep going.
But then the other thing I would just say, and it goes back to something Derek said at the very beginning, is that what we really see when we look at the Beatitudes is that we see Jesus, right? Is that these 8 statements of blessing are really 8 puzzle pieces that start to click together and show us, like, oh, this is what Jesus looks like. Like, God blesses those who are poor, who recognize their need for him. He's born into poverty. He becomes the lowest of the low. Blessed are those who mourn. He cries over Jerusalem. He weeps in the Garden of Gethsemane. God blesses those who are merciful. Who's more merciful than Jesus? And so as we look at these Beatitudes, we dare not miss the fact that the person who spoke them is the one person who truly embodied them.
That's right.
And we need to remember that the Beatitudes are Jesus. This is him.